Nate Hayden was not the kind of man who sought out trouble, nor was he the sort who ignored it when it came knocking. At 38, he had built a reputation in the region as a reliable contractor who specialized in professional exterior cleaning, power washing, facade restoration, and preservation of older buildings. He took pride in his work and maintained a clean record, with all the necessary licenses, insurance, and municipal certifications. His clients ranged from small businesses to private homeowners, and more than once he had been recommended by local community centers and veterans groups for charitable jobs. It wasn't out of vanity or a desire for recognition. Nate simply believed that if you had the skill and the time, helping those in need was the right thing to do. That was exactly what had brought him to the quiet, aging neighborhood where Margaret Hudson lived. Margaret was 77 years old, a widow for nearly 2 decades, and one of the last remaining original homeowners in the area. Her late husband had been one of the architects who had helped design the district when it was first developed in the early 1970s. The neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and once grand family homes, had started to change over the past few years. The city had begun offering incentives for redevelopment, and new luxury townhome projects were slowly creeping in, lot by lot, replacing the modest mid-century houses with sleek modern builds. While some welcomed the change, others, like Margaret, simply wanted to live out their days in the homes they had built with their families. Her house, though still structurally sound, showed its age. The once vibrant paint on the facade had faded and peeled. Mildew and grime crept along the shaded sides of the structure, and the front porch sagged ever so slightly in one corner. The local property association, as they styled themselves, an unelected board of homeowners led by a man named Gary Stanton, had started increasing pressure on older residents. Margaret had received several citations over the past year for failure to maintain property appearance in accordance with community standards, a thinly veiled attempt to coerce her into selling. Fines accumulated quickly, and the association had the means to place liens against properties through municipal channels. Margaret had tried to keep up as best she could on her fixed income, but professional cleaning and repairs were beyond her budget. That was where Nate came in. A volunteer coordinator from the local church group had reached out to him after Margaret confided that she feared she might lose her home if the citations continued. Nate had reviewed the case and agreed to take on the cleaning job free of charge. More importantly, he made sure to do everything by the book. He filed a service notice with the city, notified the property association in writing that he would be performing restorative cleaning as an approved volunteer service, and posted the necessary public notification on the windshield of his work truck, which he parked prominently at the curb in front of the house. He knew enough about neighborhood politics to anticipate potential objections and wasn't about to give anyone ammunition for harassment. The morning he arrived, the sky was clear, the temperature mild. Perfect weather for the work ahead. He greeted Margaret warmly, took a quick walk around the house with her to assess the most critical areas, and began setting up his equipment. His rig was state-of-the-art: a mounted power washer with variable nozzles, a custom filtration system, and biodegradable cleaning agents designed specifically for older painted surfaces. He worked with precision and care, starting from the upper corners of the house and working his way down to avoid streaking. As he moved along the side of the house, he noticed something odd. Near the foundation, in the mulch bed beneath a row of overgrown shrubs, several small metal stakes had been hammered into the ground, each marked with bright orange survey tape. The stakes formed a rough perimeter around the house, extending several feet beyond the existing property line markers. Nate paused, inspecting them more closely. They weren't the usual utility flags or surveyor's markers. These were heavy-duty construction stakes, the kind used to demarcate demolition zones or indicate structural assessments. His brow furrowed. Margaret hadn't mentioned any city surveys or construction plans, and there were no public notices posted anywhere nearby. It smelled wrong. He took a few discreet photos with his phone. Not out of paranoia, but as a matter of habit. Documentation was a contractor's best friend, especially when working in contentious areas. As he resumed his work, a sense of unease settled in the back of his mind. He had seen this pattern before, in other neighborhoods where redevelopment interests moved in. Sudden inspections, mystery markers, bogus citations, and relentless pressure on legacy homeowners. It was always framed as progress or community improvement, but in reality, it was about driving out those who no longer fit the desired aesthetic or financial profile. An hour into the job, as he was working on the back facade, he heard the sound of tires crunching gravel on the narrow side street. A sleek black SUV pulled up and parked across from his truck. The driver's window rolled down and a man in his late 50s, tall with a stocky build and graying hair cut in a severe military style, stepped out. It was Gary Stanton, the president of the Property Association. Nate had heard of him. A former corporate manager with a reputation for aggressive tactics and an inflated sense of authority. Stanton wore an impeccably pressed polo shirt with the association's logo embroidered on the chest and carried a thick folder under one arm. He approached with the practiced stride of a man used to intimidating others. Nate shut off the power washer and met him near the front steps, keeping his posture neutral but alert. Stanton wasted no time. "You'll need to cease operations immediately," he said, voice clipped and cold. "This property is currently under inspection for structural integrity violations." Any unauthorized work could interfere with official assessments and will be considered a violation of community code. Nate remained calm. "I've got my permits on file with the city," he replied evenly. "I'm performing restorative cleaning only, no structural alterations. Notices were submitted, and my vehicle is clearly marked." Stanton's eyes narrowed, but he didn't look at the documents Nate produced. Instead, he glanced toward the side of the house where the metal stakes were barely visible through the shrubbery. "I'm aware of your so-called volunteer status," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "But as president of this community, I have an obligation to ensure that no further deterioration or liability occurs on properties under review. You're interfering with an ongoing process." Margaret, who had come to the porch with a worried expression, spoke up. "Mr. Stanton, I never agreed to any inspection. No one from the city notified me." Stanton ignored her entirely, focusing on Nate. "This is your only warning," he said quietly. "Pack up your equipment and leave. If you choose to proceed, there will be consequences." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked back to his SUV. Moments later, as he drove off, another vehicle, an unmarked gray van, rolled slowly past the house, its driver obscured by darkened windows. The van paused briefly in front of the property, then continued down the street. Nate watched it go, a cold knot forming in his gut. He didn't say anything to Margaret, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily, but he made a mental note to call his legal contact once the day's work was done. For now, he would continue, carefully, lawfully, and with eyes wide open. What he didn't know yet was just how far Stanton and his allies were willing to go to remove what they saw as obstacles to their plans, and how quickly a routine volunteer job could escalate into something far more dangerous. The rest of that day passed without further incident, but Nate could not shake the sense that something had shifted. He finished cleaning the side of the house and started on the rear facade, taking care to avoid the older wooden trim near the porch which could be damaged by high pressure. Margaret had retreated inside, clearly unsettled after the encounter with Stanton. Nate checked in on her between tasks, offering calm reassurance, though he himself remained on alert. His instincts, honed over years of dealing with difficult clients and bureaucratic nonsense, told him the situation was more serious than it appeared on the surface. As dusk approached, Nate packed up for the day, double-checking that all equipment was secure in the truck. He also took another round of photographs, the house exterior after cleaning, the marked stakes, and the general state of the property. He preferred to keep meticulous records, not just for personal protection, but because such documentation had proven valuable in legal disputes he had witnessed in other neighborhoods undergoing redevelopment pressure. Later that evening, after returning home and eating a quick meal, Nate made good on his earlier thought and contacted his legal acquaintance, a local attorney named Paul Grayson. Paul wasn't a close friend, but he was trustworthy and had previously handled property cases involving shady association practices. Nate gave him a brief summary of the day's events, highlighting the encounter with Stanton and the mysterious survey stakes. Paul's reaction was immediate. They're laying groundwork for a condemnation claim or a forced buyout. Those markers are the first step. If they can argue the structure is unsafe, they can push for municipal intervention. Once the city posts a notice, it's almost impossible to fight without months in court. Nate frowned, pacing his small living room. Margaret doesn't even know about any inspection. There's no posted notice, no official documentation. Paul responded grimly. That's the play. They work the system quietly first. Then they hit the homeowner with a "you failed to comply" notice when it's too late. And they'll use any excuse to claim third-party interference, like you being there cleaning. That night, Nate barely slept. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had dealt with enough corporate types and petty tyrants to be used to intimidation tactics. But Margaret was another matter. She was vulnerable, and he doubted she had the resources to fight a protracted legal battle. By morning, he resolved to return to the job site as scheduled, but with even more caution. The following day dawned gray and humid, the air thick with an approaching storm. Nate arrived early before 8, finding Margaret already up and nervously sipping tea on the porch. Her face brightened slightly when she saw him, though the worry lines remained etched deep. "I didn't sleep well," she admitted softly. "Kept thinking about what that man said. I'm not sure what I should do." "You're doing the right thing by staying calm," Nate replied, unloading his equipment. "I spoke with someone who knows this game. They're trying to force you out without giving you a fair chance. But everything we're doing here is legal. I've filed the notices. You have the right to maintain your property." He resumed work on the rear facade, focusing on the upper story windowsills. By mid-morning, the first sign of new trouble appeared. A municipal utility truck pulled up, not a regular service vehicle, but one from the Infrastructure Safety Division, a department Nate knew often worked hand-in-hand with developers. 2 men in orange vests got out, began taking photos of the curb, sidewalk, and the driveway apron. When Nate approached to ask their purpose, they offered only a curt, "Routine safety survey, sir," then continued their work without further comment. Shortly after, a white pickup from Community Services arrived and parked down the block. The driver remained inside, observing the house through a pair of binoculars. It was the kind of quiet, creeping surveillance designed to make a person uncomfortable without crossing any legal lines. Nate snapped photos of the truck and its license plate, sent them to Paul with a short message. "More pressure today, documenting everything." Paul replied almost instantly. "Good. Keep everything. They're building a case, or trying to." By early afternoon, the tension escalated. Margaret received a hand-delivered envelope, stamped "Urgent." Inside was a letter on association letterhead, unsigned, stating, "Due to recent reports of unauthorized activity and potential structural compromise, you are strongly advised to vacate the premises pending full review." It carried no legal authority, but the wording was clearly crafted to intimidate. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it aloud to Nate. He took the letter, scanned it with his phone, and reassured her. "They're bluffing. There's no lawful order here. They want you scared enough to leave voluntarily." Determined not to let the scare tactics win, Nate continued working into the late afternoon despite the oppressive heat. The storm finally broke around 4, sending a downpour that forced him to halt. As he packed up under the cover of the porch, he noticed yet another unmarked van cruise slowly past, this time with a small drone lifting off from its rear hatch. The drone hovered briefly over Margaret's property before zipping away down the street. This was no longer subtle harassment. It was active surveillance. Frustrated, but careful, Nate again documented everything and reported the incident to Paul, who advised him to file a formal report with the city inspector's office. "They're counting on nobody pushing back officially," Paul warned. "But if you document and file complaints now, it forces them into the open. They hate public records." The breaking point came the next morning. Nate arrived to find Margaret visibly shaken. Sometime overnight, someone had entered the yard and spray-painted a crude red X on the side of the house, a not-so-subtle mark often used to designate condemned buildings in redevelopment zones. Worse, her mailbox had been forced open, its contents soaked from the rain. Nate photographed the vandalism, immediately called the non-emergency police line, and waited with Margaret until an officer arrived. To his credit, the officer was professional, took a report, and noted the growing pattern of intimidation. "We've had a few complaints in this district lately," he admitted quietly, "but proving who's behind it, that's tricky." Nate thanked him, but knew words alone would not deter Stanton or his cronies. The association president had already demonstrated his willingness to ignore rules, and with big money interests likely backing the redevelopment push, the harassment would only intensify. Still, Nate was resolute. He was not about to abandon Margaret, and he would not be bullied off a legal job. As he resumed work later that morning, carefully washing the front columns, another escalation occurred. Stanton himself returned this time without warning, pulling up in his SUV and exiting with a hard case in hand. Not a legal folder, but a rugged equipment case of the type used for surveying instruments or, more ominously, weapons transport. Nate's muscles tensed as he kept an eye on the man while continuing his work. Stanton walked directly up the driveway, stopping several feet from where Nate stood. Without raising his voice, he said, "I warned you. You've been told to stop. You're endangering yourself and others. If you continue, I will take appropriate action." Nate remained outwardly calm but made no move to stop. "I'm on a permitted job site. You have no authority to issue stop orders. If you have a legitimate concern, file it with the city." For several tense moments, Stanton said nothing, simply watching with cold, calculating eyes. Then, without further comment, he turned and returned to his SUV, the hard case still clutched in his hand. The encounter left Nate on edge. Stanton was not posturing anymore. The man was preparing to act. By the end of that day, Nate knew without question that the situation was approaching a dangerous turning point. The pattern was clear. They were escalating pressure daily, hoping to provoke a misstep or frighten Margaret into surrendering her home. What remained uncertain was just how far Stanton was willing to go to achieve his goal. Nate resolved to be ready, and to ensure that if the confrontation came, it would be on lawful, documented terms, with no opportunity for Stanton to twist the narrative. He did not yet realize that the next act in this unfolding conflict would leave the realm of legal maneuvering entirely, and cross a line from which there would be no easy return. By the following morning, Nate had shifted fully into professional defensive mode. The repeated warnings, surveillance, and direct intimidation from Stanton had eliminated any lingering doubt about the stakes of this job. This was no longer a matter of a petty property dispute. This was now about power, control, and calculated pressure to drive a vulnerable resident out of her home. Nate was not a man prone to dramatics or paranoia, but experience had taught him that such patterns were rarely random, and if he ignored the signs, it would not only place him at personal risk, but leave Margaret exposed to further abuse. Before arriving at her house that day, he stopped by his office to pull hard copies of all submitted permits and notices. along with printed photos and time-stamped records of the harassment thus far. He placed everything into a weatherproof folder which he kept in his truck, ready to produce at a moment's notice. He also brought a spare body camera, not worn openly, but clipped discreetly under his outer shirt, a precaution he had employed on several contentious job sites in the past. When he arrived on Margaret Street just after 7:30, the signs of mounting tension were immediate. A different utility truck, this one from the county's Environmental Services Division, was parked 2 lots down, its driver seemingly idling with no active work underway. Another unfamiliar sedan with dark windows was parked across from the house, its occupant barely visible through the glass but clearly watching. Nate parked his truck deliberately in full view, posted the day's work notice as usual, and greeted Margaret, who was visibly more anxious than before. Her voice trembled as she greeted him. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Nate. It's like they're circling." "They are," Nate replied frankly but with calm resolve. "But you're not alone, and we're not doing anything illegal. I've got everything documented. We're going to proceed by the book. Let them push. We'll hold the line." His calm steadied her somewhat, and she returned inside while Nate began prepping his equipment for the day's tasks. An hour into the morning's work, as Nate was cleaning the decorative stonework along the base of the front steps, another vehicle approached. A glossy white SUV bearing the logo of the association on its side panel. From it emerged 3 men. Stanton himself, accompanied by 2 unknown individuals dressed in matching navy polos and khakis. They carried clipboards and shoulder bags that suggested either consultants or inspectors of some kind, though Nate strongly suspected they were neither licensed nor city-sanctioned. The trio approached as a unit, Stanton at the fore. A thin smile stretched unnaturally across his face. Without a preamble, Stanton addressed Nate with forced politeness. "Good morning. We are here today to conduct a preliminary site safety review. You are advised to suspend all work immediately while this assessment is underway." Nate shut off his washer and stood upright, deliberately calm. "Unless you have an official city-issued stop work order, which I doubt you do, this is a permitted restoration job, and I will continue in compliance with municipal regulations. If you interfere, I will report it as obstruction." The 2 men behind Stanton exchanged glances but remained silent. Stanton's smile tightened. "Mr. Hayden, you are already on notice. Any further provocation will be escalated accordingly. You are creating a liability situation that could have serious consequences." Nate produced the folder from his truck and handed Stanton a copy of the filed permits. "Here are the relevant documents. You are free to review them. I suggest you do so before making further threats." For several long moments, Stanton stood motionless, eyes flicking between the papers and Nate's impassive expression. Then, without taking the documents, he gestured curtly to his companions. "Document the current site condition." The 2 men began photographing various angles of the house and property, though their focus was suspiciously skewed. They seemed intent on capturing the aging porch, cracked pavement, and any other feature that could later be used to argue for structural instability. Nate resumed his work, pointedly ignoring the observers. He was under no illusion that this would deter them, but by continuing calmly and professionally, he denied them any visual of confrontation or aggression they might later twist in reports. After roughly 20 minutes, the trio departed, Stanton pausing at the sidewalk to deliver one final comment. "Enjoy your day, Mr. Hayden. Things can change very quickly." Nate gave no reply, watching impassively as they drove off. By midday, the weather had cleared, and Nate was making good progress on the rear facade. Margaret, though still shaken, insisted on bringing out lunch for him, an act of simple hospitality that underscored her determination to remain dignified despite the mounting stress. "No." As they ate under the shaded porch, Nate noticed a new arrival. a black pickup truck with out-of-state plates, rolling slowly past the property twice before parking half a block down. The driver remained inside, occasionally glancing toward the house. Nate's internal alarms triggered again. This was classic soft surveillance designed to unsettle. Choosing prudence over confrontation, Nate discreetly photographed the vehicle and again forwarded the images and details to Paul. The attorney's reply was terse. "They're trying to build a harassment buffer. Stay clean. If they make a move, we file formally." Nate agreed and continued his work, but he remained sharply alert. That alertness proved warranted. Around 3 o'clock, as he was cleaning the final section of rear siding, a sharp clattering sound drew his attention to the front of the house. Moving quickly, he found that the metal stakes, the same unauthorized survey markers he had documented days earlier, had been freshly augmented with newly staked caution tape, strung across the front lawn in a makeshift perimeter. The message was clear: visual intimidation, signaling that the property was unsafe despite no official declaration. Margaret emerged onto the porch, aghast. "They're marking me for condemnation," she whispered, voice cracking. Nate steadied her gently. "They can mark whatever they like. Without city orders, it's theater, but it's escalating. We need to make this official." Without hesitation, Nate called the city inspector's office and filed a formal request for immediate site review, citing suspected unauthorized tampering and harassment. He also reported the new perimeter to the responding officer from the previous vandalism incident, who promised to log the update. As an added precaution, Nate phoned Paul once more, who advised that it was now time to prepare for potential legal action. "We're getting close to the line where Stanton may do something reckless," Paul warned grimly. "Document everything and don't engage." Nate heeded the advice. He resumed work with deliberate calm, taking care not to interact with any observers. The final task of the day involved cleaning the upper-story windows, a job requiring extended reach and full concentration. As he worked, a chill ran through him, a sixth sense honed by years on varied work sites. Glancing down briefly, he spotted Stanton's SUV idling at the end of the block, the president visible behind the wheel, staring intently toward the house. Nate's hands remained steady on the equipment, but mentally he filed the observation with growing concern. By the time he finished and packed his gear, the SUV had vanished, but the sense of looming confrontation remained palpable. Margaret thanked him profusely, though her voice wavered. "You've already done more than I could ask, Nate, but please, be careful." "I will," he assured her, "and I'm not going anywhere. They've pushed too far now." He left that evening knowing that the escalation was far from over, and that Stanton's next move might well break the bounds of legal maneuvering entirely. By the time Nate returned the following morning, the air had shifted from tense to electric with unspoken threat. The intimidation tactics, the surveillance, and Stanton's overt hostility had built to an undeniable crescendo. Nate sensed that the confrontation he had anticipated was no longer a matter of if, but when. He arrived earlier than usual, wanting time to prepare before activity began on the street. His first task was to walk the perimeter of Margaret's property and photograph everything anew. The unauthorized caution tape was still strung across the front yard, though it had been further reinforced overnight with fresh orange unsafe structure signs, none of which bore any municipal seal or official authorization. More tellingly, the spray-painted red X on the rear siding remained uncleaned, a visual cue meant to instill fear. Nate documented each item meticulously, uploading copies to a secure cloud folder shared with Paul. His lawyer responded almost immediately. "You're building a solid harassment file. Stay the course." Margaret met him at the door, her expression weary but determined. She had spent the night contacting her late husband's former colleagues, some of whom still held influence in the local architectural community. They had promised to make inquiries with the city's Historical Preservation Board, a potential avenue of defense should Stanton move to press condemnation proceedings. The effort heartened Nate. He knew that outside scrutiny was the one factor these types of operators despised most. The morning proceeded quietly, the normal sounds of the neighborhood subdued. Nate resumed work on the final detailing of the cleaned surfaces, focusing on the decorative woodwork under the eaves, a delicate task requiring steady hands and careful pressure control. As he worked, he kept a peripheral eye on the street, noting the reappearance of the unmarked black pickup from the previous day, now parked at a slightly different angle, its driver again stationary and observing. Shortly before noon, a new and deeply concerning development unfolded. A pair of unfamiliar vehicles arrived in tandem, a municipal engineering van and a large flatbed truck carrying portable ground-penetrating radar equipment. 4 men disembarked, 2 in city uniforms, 2 in contractor attire. They began setting up the radar array on the street directly in front of Margaret's property, without any prior notice or posted work order. Nate approached the lead technician, politely inquiring about the nature of the operation. The man, clearly uncomfortable, replied that they were conducting routine subsurface assessments under a directive issued through the association's Infrastructure Improvement Committee. Nate immediately saw through the pretext. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were often used to identify old utility lines or structural voids, precisely the type of findings that could be leveraged to claim subsidence or foundational instability, thereby justifying emergency action against a property. He asked for a copy of the work order or permit. The technician hesitated, then admitted they had no documentation on site. Nate photographed the equipment and operators, then called Paul for guidance. "Classic move," Paul said grimly. They're fishing for anything to hang a condemnation on. Without permits, they're operating illegally. Call it in." Nate promptly contacted the city inspector's office, filing a formal complaint regarding unauthorized utility work. Within 30 minutes, a municipal supervisor arrived on scene, examined the setup, and ordered the crew to cease operations pending review. The flatbed truck departed, but not before Nate captured additional photographic evidence. Margaret, who had witnessed the exchange from her porch, looked both relieved and shaken. "They're getting desperate," she said quietly. Nate nodded. "And desperate people make mistakes. That's what we're counting on." He resumed his work, though his vigilance remained heightened. The day's next major escalation occurred just after 2 o'clock. As Nate was carefully restoring the wooden shutters on the upper windows, a familiar engine note reached his ears. Stanton's SUV, approaching at speed. The vehicle pulled abruptly into the driveway, skidding slightly on the loose gravel. Stanton exited quickly, face flushed, eyes blazing with thinly veiled fury. He carried no clipboard this time, only a slim briefcase. Without preamble, Stanton strode to the porch and addressed Margaret directly, ignoring Nate entirely. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, voice tight, "I must insist that you vacate this property immediately. Your continued occupation is creating a hazardous condition. We have received multiple reports of foundational compromise. The association will be posting an emergency evacuation order within 24 hours. Margaret stood her ground. "You have no such authority," she replied evenly. "I have received no official notice from the city." At this, Stanton's composure visibly cracked. He turned to Nate, voice rising. "And you're complicit in this endangerment. You've been warned repeatedly. This is your final notice. Cease all operations and leave the premises, or you will face consequences." Nate met his gaze calmly. "I'm on a permitted job site. If you believe otherwise, file it with the city." Threats won't change the facts. For a charged moment, Stanton seemed on the verge of physical aggression. His fists clenched, his jaw worked. Then, without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed back to his vehicle. slamming the door so hard the SUV rocked on its suspension. He sat there for several long minutes, glaring through the windshield before finally peeling away down the street. Nate exhaled slowly, the tension in his muscles easing but not dissipating. He knew the confrontation had entered a new phase. Stanton was no longer posturing for legal advantage. He was acting on raw emotion and personal vendetta. Such volatility made him unpredictable and dangerous. That evening, after finishing the day's work and securing his equipment, Nate took the additional step of meeting with Paul in person. Over coffee at the attorney's office, they reviewed the compiled evidence and discussed next steps. "We're very close to the threshold for an injunction," Paul advised. "If Stanton escalates again, especially with any physical interference, we can petition for a protective order and possibly force a formal investigation into the association's conduct." Nate agreed, though he remained wary. "I don't think he's going to wait for the legal process," he said quietly. "He's losing control." Paul nodded grimly. "Then be ready, and document everything. The more we have on record, the stronger our position will be." As Nate drove home that night, the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. He had seen situations like this spiral out of control before, and all signs pointed to Stanton preparing to cross a line from which there would be no return. The next move, Nate was certain, would not be another legal ploy or symbolic gesture. It would be something far more direct and far more dangerous. By the next morning, Nate was operating on little sleep and a grim sense of purpose. After the prior day's direct confrontation, it was clear that Stanton had reached a breaking point in his patience and would soon abandon any remaining pretense of legal maneuvering. Nate's instincts told him that today would likely mark a decisive shift in the conflict. He rose early, ran a final check on all his equipment, and reviewed the compiled case file Paul had prepared overnight. Photographs, written statements, permit copies, and logged incident reports, all carefully organized should immediate legal action become necessary. The growing dossier painted a stark picture of coordinated harassment and calculated intimidation, but Nate suspected Stanton was beyond caring about legal exposure now. What mattered to him was power, and the fact that he was visibly losing control of the situation would only drive him to more desperate acts. Arriving at Margaret's property just after sunrise, Nate found the street oddly quiet. The usual pattern of parked surveillance vehicles and hovering association contractors was absent. At first, this absence seemed almost suspicious, a possible feint to lull them into complacency. But Margaret, who met him at the porch, reported that the neighborhood had been unusually still all night. No passing vans, no shadowy observers. The tension in her voice made it clear that this calm was unsettling rather than reassuring. Nate reassured her as best he could, then began setting up for the day's final phase of work. A meticulous sealing of the restored woodwork and siding, intended to preserve the surfaces he had cleaned. It was precise, slow work requiring concentration, but his awareness of his surroundings remained sharp throughout. Midway through the morning, the first sign of renewed activity appeared. A city works crew arrived, ostensibly to conduct a sewer line inspection several blocks down. Though their work was unrelated to Margaret's property, the presence of marked city vehicles on the street served to reintroduce an air of official scrutiny. More troubling was the reappearance of Stanton's SUV, which rolled slowly past the house twice before parking at a distant intersection. Stanton himself remained inside, watching intently. Nate noted the vehicle's position but chose to continue working uninterrupted. At approximately 11:30, a new element entered the scene. A pair of uniformed private security contractors, young, broad-shouldered men wearing black tactical vests emblazoned with the generic Community Protection logo. They emerged from an unmarked SUV that had parked midway down the block and began loitering near the sidewalk, ostensibly monitoring pedestrian traffic but clearly fixated on Margaret's property. Nate observed them carefully while maintaining his work, documenting their presence with discrete photos. Shortly after noon, the situation escalated sharply. Stanton's SUV approached again, this time pulling into the driveway without hesitation. Stanton emerged quickly, carrying a long, narrow case that Nate instantly recognized as a gun case. Hard plastic with reinforced edges, designed for transporting long-barreled firearms. The sight of it sent a jolt of cold adrenaline through Nate's system. He set down his equipment and stepped to the front walkway, body camera already running beneath his shirt. Stanton wasted no time with preamble. Standing at the edge of the porch, he set down the case, opened it with deliberate slowness, and withdrew a scoped hunting rifle, a high-powered bolt-action model with a bipod attachment. His hands moved with practiced ease as he assembled the weapon, all while addressing Nate in a low, controlled voice. "You were warned, Mr. Hayden, repeatedly. You've ignored every lawful directive. You've interfered with official community safety operations. This is your last chance. Leave this property now, or face the consequences of your actions." Nate remained outwardly calm, though every nerve in his body was on edge. He kept his hands visible and voice steady. "You're brandishing a firearm in a residential zone without cause, Mr. Stanton. That's a felony. I strongly advise you to reconsider." Stanton's eyes burned with cold fury. "You're the one committing a crime here, by aiding and abetting the occupation of an unsafe structure. If the authorities won't enforce the law, then it falls to responsible citizens to act." As he spoke, Stanton chambered around with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the tense morning air. Margaret, who had witnessed the scene from inside, gasped audibly and retreated deeper into the house. Nate's mind raced. Stanton was clearly beyond reason, operating in a state of righteous delusion. Confronting him physically would only escalate the danger. Instead, Nate made the calculated choice to disengage strategically. Without turning his back on Stanton, he moved deliberately toward the side of the house, placing solid structural cover between himself and the weapon's line of fire. Simultaneously, he activated an emergency call on his phone, transmitting a live feed to local law enforcement, a feature Paul had advised installing after the prior day's events. Within minutes, the situation began drawing outside attention. A passing neighbor, seeing Stanton armed and visibly agitated, placed their own emergency call. The private security contractors, sensing imminent escalation, retreated to their vehicle and departed hastily, a clear signal that Stanton was acting without broader support. Inside the house, Margaret secured herself in a rear room, following Nate's earlier instructions for such a scenario. Nate, meanwhile, maintained cover while continuing to document the unfolding events. Stanton, realizing that external witnesses were now aware of his actions, began pacing the front yard, weapon still in hand but no longer pointed directly at the house. His muttered invectives grew louder, betraying an unraveling mental state. The arrival of the police units, heralded by approaching sirens, marked the next phase of escalation. 2 patrol cars brake to a halt at the end of the block, officers emerging with weapons drawn and taking defensive positions behind their vehicles. Through amplified commands, they ordered Stanton to disarm and surrender. For a tense moment, it appeared he might refuse, his grip on the rifle tightening visibly. Then, with a shuddering breath, he lowered the weapon and allowed it to be secured. Officers moved swiftly to take Stanton into custody, reading him his rights even as he shouted defiant proclamations about defending community standards and lawful order. The rifle, now safely in police possession, would serve as damning evidence of his reckless escalation. In the aftermath of the arrest, the street buzzed with subdued tension. Neighbors emerged cautiously, drawn by the commotion. Margaret, pale but composed, emerged to embrace Nate, her gratitude mingled with lingering shock. Officers took statements from all involved, with Nate providing detailed accounts and supplying the recorded footage from his body camera. Paul, arriving shortly thereafter, coordinated with police and ensured that a protective order against Stanton would be filed immediately. As the scene gradually cleared, Nate and Paul conferred privately. "You handled this perfectly," Paul said grimly. "By the book, no provocation. We have everything we need now, not just for civil action but potentially criminal charges." Nate nodded, though fatigue and the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on him. "Margaret needs protection," he said quietly. "This isn't over. Even with Stanton in custody, there are others behind this push." Paul agreed. "We'll move to secure an injunction against further association actions, and I'll be pressing the city to investigate the entire redevelopment scheme. They won't be able to operate in the shadows anymore." As evening fell, Nate remained on site, ensuring Margaret's immediate safety and coordinating with trusted neighbors who had stepped forward to offer support. The day's events had irrevocably altered the landscape of the conflict. The association's mask of procedural respectability had been torn away, exposing the raw abuse of power beneath. But Nate knew the battle was far from over. Though Stanton was now facing legal consequences, the financial and political interests driving the redevelopment push remained intact. The fight for Margaret's home and for the integrity of the community itself would continue, and Nate, though weary, was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The days following Stanton's arrest unfolded in a blur of legal maneuvering, public scrutiny, and a profound shift in the atmosphere of the once quiet neighborhood. Word of the incident had spread rapidly, both through official channels and informal community networks, though local news outlets had not yet run a full story. Thanks in part to the sensitivity of the ongoing investigation, residents were well aware that the head of their property association had been taken into custody after brandishing and discharging a firearm in front of Margaret Hudson's home. Fear and curiosity mingled in equal measure among the neighbors, many of whom had harbored private concerns about the association's increasingly aggressive tactics, but had been too intimidated to speak out. Stanton's public meltdown had shattered the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked the association's leadership for years. For Nate, the immediate priority remained Margaret's safety. With Stanton in custody and a protective order in place, there was a temporary lull in direct threats, but Paul warned that others within the association's ranks, or among the affiliated developers, might attempt to fill the power vacuum. At Paul's urging, Nate coordinated with trusted members of the local Architectural Preservation Board and sympathetic city officials to expedite a formal review of Margaret's property status. The goal was clear: secure historical designation or protected status that would make any further attempts at forced condemnation or redevelopment far more difficult, if not outright illegal. As part of this effort, Nate and Paul meticulously compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing the months-long pattern of harassment, unauthorized surveillance, and procedural violations committed by Stanton and his allies. They also secured sworn statements from Margaret and several neighbors, some of whom had witnessed portions of the escalating campaign. The most damning evidence, however, remained the body camera footage from the day of the armed confrontation, footage that left no room for interpretation regarding Stanton's intentions or the danger he had posed. The tipping point came when Paul, leveraging both legal expertise and strategic connections, succeeded in arranging a formal hearing before the City Council's Public Safety and Housing Subcommittee. The hearing, set for a closed session due to the sensitivity of the matter, would include testimony from Margaret, Nate, and other key witnesses, as well as presentation of the collected evidence. The outcome of this hearing would heavily influence not only the fate of Margaret's property, but also the broader scrutiny of the association's governance and the redevelopment deals quietly orchestrated in the background. On the morning of the hearing, tension hung thick in the air. Nate arrived early at City Hall accompanied by Paul and Margaret. The older woman, though visibly nervous, carried herself with quiet dignity. a stark contrast to the raw aggression Stanton had displayed. Paul reviewed their prepared statements one final time, emphasizing the importance of sticking to documented facts and avoiding speculative accusations. "The evidence speaks for itself," he reminded them. "Stay calm, stay clear, and let them see the truth." Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was charged but orderly. Council members, legal advisors, and selected city staff were present, along with a handful of observers from relevant oversight bodies. Representatives from the Property Association's legal team were also in attendance, though notably subdued in demeanor, no doubt aware of the precarious position they now occupied. The hearing commenced with procedural formalities, followed by a detailed presentation of the timeline of events. Paul's delivery was crisp and methodical, walking the council through each documented instance of harassment, unauthorized action, and procedural misconduct. When the body camera footage was played, an audible shift rippled through the room. Faces hardened, jaws tightened. Stanton's reckless escalation was undeniable. Margaret's testimony followed, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. She spoke not only of the recent ordeal but of her decades-long connection to the home and the community, framing the assault on her property rights as part of a broader erosion of civic integrity. Nate's statement reinforced this narrative, emphasizing the pattern of intimidation and the dangers posed when unchecked power was wielded without accountability. Throughout the proceedings, the association's legal representatives offered only muted rebuttals, hamstrung by the overwhelming evidence and the absence of their embattled former president. The hearing stretched over several hours, with council members posing pointed questions regarding the association's oversight, financial entanglements with developers, and the opaque processes by which properties had been targeted for redevelopment. By the session's conclusion, the tone of the chamber had shifted decisively. It was clear that momentum had turned against the association's leadership. While formal sanctions and legal actions would require further process, the immediate outcome was a resounding recommendation to halt any pending actions against Margaret's property and to initiate an independent audit of the association's governance and financial dealings. Outside City Hall, amid a subdued crowd of supporters and curious onlookers, Paul summarized the hearing's significance to Nate and Margaret. "This is a major step forward," he said. "The council's backing gives us leverage. It also sends a message to anyone thinking of continuing Stanton's campaign by proxy." Nate nodded, though his expression remained serious. "They won't give up easily," he said. "Too much money in play. But at least now the fight is in the open." Paul agreed, "And that's where we want it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant." The following days saw a flurry of activity as the council's recommendations began to ripple through official channels. The city's Historical Preservation Board accelerated its review of Margaret's property, buoyed by public sentiment and political will. Preliminary findings strongly favored protected status, which would render further redevelopment efforts legally fraught and financially unattractive. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, law enforcement expanded its investigation into Stanton's activities, uncovering troubling links between association funds and undisclosed developer contributions. Though full legal proceedings would take time, the foundations of the power structure that had enabled the campaign against Margaret were visibly crumbling. For Nate, the experience had been both exhausting and galvanizing. What had begun as a simple act of community service had evolved into a battle for fundamental rights and accountability. And while the immediate threat to Margaret had been blunted, he remained acutely aware that the broader fight, for the soul of the community and the integrity of its governance, was far from over. As he stood with Margaret on her freshly restored porch one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the tree-lined street, Nate reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scars of the conflict remained, both visible and unseen, but so too did the bonds forged through shared resolve. "We're not done yet," he said softly. Margaret nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," she agreed, But now, at least, we have a fighting chance. And with that simple acknowledgement, they turned back to face the challenges yet to come, armed now with truth, with allies, and with the hard-earned knowledge that even the most entrenched abuses of power could be challenged when good people refused to be intimidated. In the weeks that followed the city council hearing, the neighborhood that had once seemed locked in the silent grip of fear and quiet resentment began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Though the outward appearance of the tree-lined streets and stately homes remained unchanged, there was a new current beneath the surface, a sense that the long-standing dominance of the property association's inner circle had been broken, and that those who had once ruled through intimidation now faced real scrutiny and consequences. Stanton's formal indictment on multiple felony charges, including aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and criminal intimidation, sent a powerful message. Though his attorneys moved swiftly to arrange a bail release, the protective orders remained in force, barring him from any contact with Margaret or Nate and from setting foot within the immediate vicinity of her property. His absence from public view and the ongoing legal storm surrounding his actions left the association rudderless, its remaining board members scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. Meanwhile, the independent audit ordered by the city council proceeded rapidly, uncovering a disturbing web of financial irregularities and undeclared relationships with multiple redevelopment firms. Preliminary findings, leaked quietly through sympathetic channels, confirmed what many residents had long suspected. The association had operated less as a neutral body concerned with community welfare and more as an arm of private development. Interests using fines, selective enforcement, and procedural manipulation to clear the way for lucrative land acquisitions. These revelations emboldened other homeowners who had previously remained silent. In private conversations and small gatherings, they began to share their own stories of harassment and coercion, many of which echoed the tactics used against Margaret. Encouraged by Nate's example and the public stance taken by Paul and the Preservation Board, several of these residents began formalizing complaints and preparing to testify in future hearings. Margaret's property, once marked for quiet erasure, now stood as a symbol of resistance and resilience. The city's Historical Preservation Board moved swiftly, issuing a provisional protective designation while completing the final review process. The designation not only shielded her home from future redevelopment efforts but also opened the door to grant-funded restoration assistance, ensuring that the structure's historical and cultural value would be preserved for future generations. For Margaret, the emotional weight of this outcome was profound. The house that she and her late husband had built together, a place woven through with the memories of a lifetime, had been saved not by force or luck, but through the steadfast commitment of those unwilling to bow to fear. In quiet moments, she often reflected on how close she had come to losing it all, and on the courage it had taken to fight back. For Nate, the experience had left an indelible mark. The events that had unfolded over those tense weeks had tested him in ways no professional training could fully prepare one for. Yet, through it all, he had held to a simple principle: do what is right, regardless of the cost. That principle had guided every choice, from the first decision to take on the job, to each careful step through the escalating conflict, to the moment he had stood his ground in the face of a loaded weapon. Now, as the legal and civic process ground forward, he remained committed to seeing the work through to its proper conclusion. At Paul's urging, Nate agreed to serve as an advisor to a new community oversight committee being organized in response to the scandal. Comprised of homeowners, preservationists, and independent legal observers, the committee's mandate was clear: to ensure that the property association, once restructured under court supervision, would operate transparently and in genuine service to the community's interests. It was not a role Nate had sought, nor one he particularly relished. He preferred the clarity of honest work to the murk of politics, but he understood the necessity of staying engaged. Power unchecked inevitably bred corruption. Only vigilance could prevent its return. As the summer waned into early autumn, life in the neighborhood began to settle into a new rhythm. The overt tension of prior months gave way to cautious optimism. Margaret's home, once marked by graffiti and illegal survey stakes, now gleamed beneath freshly restored siding and trim, its renewed facade a quiet testament to perseverance. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now greeted one another with nods and tentative conversation. The unspoken barriers of fear and mistrust had begun to erode. One crisp afternoon, as Nate completed a routine follow-up inspection of the restored surfaces, he and Margaret sat together on the porch, sipping tea beneath the gentle sway of the oak branches overhead. The conversation turned, inevitably, to all that had transpired. "You saved my home, Nate," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "And more than that, you reminded this community that we still have a voice." Nate shook his head modestly. "You saved it by standing your ground," he replied. "I just helped clear the way." As the sun dipped low, casting long golden beams across the quiet street, a small group of neighbors passed by, offering waves and greetings. Among them were two homeowners who had recently joined the oversight committee, their expressions now marked by the same resolve that had once seemed so rare. Nate watched them go with a faint smile. Change, he knew, was slow work, uneven, uncertain, but it had begun, and in that there was hope. Later that evening, as he packed his truck and prepared to leave, Margaret paused beside him. "Do you think they'll try again?" she asked, the shadow of old fears still present. Nate met her gaze steadily. "Maybe," he said honestly. "There's always someone who thinks they can bend the rules, but next time, they'll know this community can fight back." Margaret nodded, her shoulders squared with quiet strength. "Then we'll be ready." With that, Nate climbed into his truck, the familiar rumble of the engine grounding him in the simple truths that had carried him through. There would always be more battles ahead, more work to be done. But for now, one home had been defended, one wrong exposed, one community awakened, and that was enough.